Yesterday we discussed Russia's relations with the West, the United States, and Europe. And indeed, that used to be for 3 centuries the traditional focus of Russia's foreign policy. First it was Europe from the 18th until the mid-20th centuries, and then it was the United States since after the end of the Second World War. But the big change that we discussed yesterday, the big change that happened in 2014 as a result of the Ukraine crisis, that changed it. Now this focus is no longer the focus. It's still important. Europe is important. The United States is all important. But it is also not the only or even the prime focus. We discussed yesterday that the relationship between Russia and the United States does not promise much improvement in the foreseeable future. The possibilities of an improved relationship with the European Union exist, but they are pretty limited. They are pretty limited by what happens within the European Union, within the countries that make up the European Union, and what happens in the transatlantic relationship between the EU and the US. But there is more to my story than just a recap of some of yesterday's theses. Russia has acquired, or should I say, continues acquiring a new self-image. It is no longer longing to be part of Europe or part of the West. Russia is Russia, neither more, which means that a Russia plus, a greater Russia, a Russia that would include the former land empire, is not on the cards. But neither is Russia minus, so it's neither more nor less. It's Russia minus, in my view, a Russia that has transferred part of its sovereignty to a supranational or multinational body, such as the European Union or NATO or any formal or informal alliance with the United States. That Russia is equally not on the cards. So what we have in Russia is a country that no longer defines itself as an aspiring member of the Western community, which was a big prize, as many of us remember, in 1991 when the Soviet Union unraveled. It's a country that is clearly part of the non-West. Well, the non-West, of course, is a very nebulous concept. It's defined only by the various parts of that group not belonging to the international community of Western nations. Even at the beginning of the 21st century, in 2003, Russia was listed as a member of a BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. That group was expected to do extremely well economically at that time. It was considered to be the leaders of the emerging economies, the emerging world, the emerging great powers of the 21st century. For about a decade, Russia, it seems, had a finger in all pies, or fingers in all pies, all possible pies. It was a member of BRICS. It had a strategic partnership relationship with China. It had an excellent relationship with India, but at the same time, it was a member of the G8. It had a formal strategic partnership relationship with NATO. It had a very close partnership with the European Union, so close, just think of it, today in particular, that Russian and European leaders, i.e. the leaders of the European Union, European Commission, and the Council of Europe, and the President of Russia would meet twice a year to discuss the progress in the Russia-EU relations. But since 2014, and since Russia was expelled from the G8 group that reconstituted itself as the G7, Russia has no fingers in Western pies. It is an outcast as far as the Western community is concerned. But Russia, far from being isolated, is very much active in other fora, in the fora of non-Western countries. At the time when the G7 met just a few days ago in Canada, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is led by China, as the name suggests, and Russia, were meeting in China, in Qingdao. And that was a very different meeting from the one in Canada. Probably the closest analogy to the G7 is the global group of BRICS that includes, apart from the countries that we already mentioned, also South Africa. And that group, again, presents a global, a group of global players that come from all parts of the world, and in that sense, it is more analogous to the G7 group. The SCO, a lot of people compare it to NATO, although both organizations are the SCO and BRICS are very different from the organizations of Western countries, primarily in their not being a leader in those organizations. And that is something that suits Russia. You would recall from yesterday's conversation that one thing that Russian elites totally abhor is a relationship in which they have to submit to somebody else's leadership. They rejected America's leadership, but they did not reject America's leadership only to submit themselves to China's leadership. So Russia, as we discussed yesterday, increasingly sees itself as being placed in what may be called Greater Eurasia, which is this grand continent that stretches all the way from Portugal to Korea, from the Arctic to the Indian Ocean. And in the non-European part of that Greater Eurasia, there's a big diversity of countries that call for a very different, very discrete set of policies by anyone who wants to play a role in that part of the world, not to speak of being a major actor in that part of the world. And Russia certainly wants to be a major actor in that part of the world. So from Moscow's perspective, there is no such thing as Asia as a unit. There are different elements of Asia. There are different countries in Asia. You have the global or emerging global superpower of China that is a direct neighbor of Russia over 4,300 and if I'm not mistaken, 55 kilometers, used to be 7,000 kilometers until the breakup of the Soviet Union. It's a direct neighbor and Eurasia's biggest power. Russia also has to deal with a country that is a competitor of China, with a population just as big and getting bigger, and at present the rate of growth, which is higher than China's, and that's India. Russia also has to deal with economic powerhouses of Japan, the major powerhouse, and the Republic of Korea, which are both allies of the United States. Russia has to find ways to build relationships with emerging regional powers such as Indonesia, Pakistan, both of which are bigger in terms of the population than Russia. And Pakistan is also a nuclear power. Now Russia has to deal with a very interesting and attractive unit such as ASEAN. Of course, part of Asia is a very close neighbor of Russia and even a former borderland of both the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire, and I'm talking about Central Asia plus Mongolia. And of course, there's the Middle East with Iran and Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and of course Israel. So you have a very, very diverse set of countries with very diverse interests and very different histories of relations with Moscow. Well, as I said, it may be highly diverse, but there's one dominant power, dominant giant in the region, and that is China. Even as Russia turned itself more toward Asia and started, if you like, moving closer to its Asian neighbors, and that actually predates the Ukraine crisis. Russia's turn to the east was very much pushed by Vladimir Putin almost from the very beginning of his presidency. I recall when he was a very young president in the summer of 2000, and he traveled to the Sino-Russian border, and he held a meeting with the locals. And he said something very important and very striking. He said, I wonder what language will be spoken here a generation or two from now. And that was a very clear signal of the young president's awareness of the demographic issues plaguing Russia and the issues of underdevelopment that undermined Russia's standing in Asia. Putin has been very keen on developing the Asian part of Russia, the Far East and Siberia, for many years. As I said, almost from the very start of his presidency. The challenge that he had to face is very stark. It is in Asia, for Russia, that's the Far East and Siberia, that the country's most depressed region physically touches on the world's most dynamic parts. And I'm referring to China, and I'm referring to the developed countries such as Japan and Korea. And Putin's logic was very clear. If we fail to develop the region, if we fail to populate the region with people from Russia and others who would accept Russia's presence here within its borders, who would be loyal to the Russian state, we're going to lose the territory. It's interesting that his first annual address to the nation, or not in formal terms, it's the address to the Federal Assembly. He focused on the issue of demographics. Demographics in 2000 were very dire. The prognosis was very dire for Russia. It has improved somewhat, and also as a result of Mr. Putin's government's efforts, but it's still pretty bleak. It sees Russia continuing to lose in population terms, its population getting older, without getting, at least for the time being, more productive. So for Putin, the most serious challenge to Russia's statehood, Russia's place in the world, is not so much relations with the United States, which he basically believes it can be managed one way or another. And we talked about deterrence working. We talked about the relationship, although it has deteriorated markedly and is in very bad shape, but that relationship is not going to lead to a major catastrophe. There are red lines that are being observed. There are professionals dealing with issues. There are dangers, but they can be managed. But in relations with the countries of Asia, if Russia is not doing enough to upgrade its economy, to upgrade the quality of its population, then Russia is going to lose. And to lose could mean essentially losing part of its sovereignty, losing part of its independence, and that is something that would amount to a catastrophe. So as Russia was turning east, Asia's biggest economy and biggest country started to turn west in geographical terms. China, in the last few years, has embarked on a trek that got the name of Belt and Road Initiative. It is still pretty vague. You talk to Chinese scholars and they give you all sorts of commentaries on what it means and what it entails, but it is still a pretty vague concept. Well, vague it may be, but if you look at what's happening on the ground, you will be stunned by how much has been achieved so far. And China is clearly reaching out to the developed countries in Europe across the territory of the nations that lie between China and Europe. Those include Central Asia, the Middle East, and Russia. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI as it's called, has been offered to, in terms of partnership, to a lot of neighboring countries. And virtually all of them, with one big exception, and that's India, have joined in. Now, Russia decided not to join, because joining means, as we discussed, accepting someone's primacy. Russia has come up with an idea of harmonizing its own integrationist project in Central Asia, the Eurasian Economic Union, with the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese accepted the idea, and what actually harmonization means is, I think at this point, as nebulous and as vague as the concept of the Belt and Road Initiative itself. But again, let me emphasize, the most important foreign policy issue for Russia going forward is how to deal with a China that has become Eurasia's biggest and most dynamic power. Russians have known the Chinese for roughly 3+ centuries. The first treaty between the two countries was negotiated in 1689. Since the 19th century until the second half of the 20th century, China used to be partially controlled by Russia, or it was led by Russia in the world as the big brother within the communist system, which Chinese resented. Now, things have changed dramatically, and in China's favor. Before Deng Xiaoping started his reform project in 1978, the GDP of the People's Republic of China was about 40% of the GDP of the Russian Republic within the Soviet Union. That was in 1978. Today, China is roughly 5 times or more bigger economically than Russia. And it all happened within 40 years. It was certainly difficult for the Russians to accept this change, but I should say to their credit that they managed to do that. They managed to understand and accept that China is the region's biggest boy and has to be dealt with as such. There's something else that the Russians and the Chinese have managed to do. Till Mikhail Gorbachev visited China in May 1989, just before Tiananmen, China and the Soviet Union had been waging a Cold War of their own for roughly 3 decades. And that was a parallel Cold War to the Cold War that the Soviet Union was waging against NATO and the United States and the U.S. system of alliances. It cost the Soviet Union tremendous resources, but they made it up. Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping buried the hatchet in May 1989. Since that time, for roughly 3 decades, the Sino-Russian partnership has been going strong. And despite this role reversal, despite the major change of balance in the relations between the two countries, the relationship has been improving constantly over 3 decades. Officially, it is called a strategic partnership. The actual phrase is much longer, but I don't think it captures the essence of the relationship very well. The term strategic partnership has been vastly overused, vastly inflated. Something else is needed in place of that. Some time ago, I've come up with a word that I could not find in either English or Russian, but I did manage to find in French. And the word is entente, which is, in my view, something that captures the nature of the relationship. It is very much a common understanding between the leaderships of China and Russia of the present world order and of the need to change, reform, overcome that world order. There's also a fair amount of agreement between them regarding some of the principles of international relations. And this is registered each time that the Russian delegate and the Chinese delegate vote at the United Nations. But the word entente is, for all its beauty, does not yet give enough sense of the actual formula of the relationship. The formula, in my view, could be best described as follows. China and Russia will never be against each other, but they will not necessarily always be together. This is a fine formula because it is a combination of mutual reassurance. Neither country needs to fear a stab in the back. That's very important. But neither country is closely tied to each other, to the other, so that it loses a freedom of maneuver. So you have reassurance plus flexibility. And indeed, if you look at how Russia and China relate to various issues of concern to the other, you will see what I mean. There's a fair amount of agreement, again, as I mentioned, registered in the frequent voting within the United Nations system. But then it is very interesting how they deal with disagreements. China does not recognize Crimea as part of Russia, nor does it recognize Abkhazia's or South Ossetia's independence. Russia, for its part, does not stand with China in China's territorial claims either in the South or in the East China Seas. Russia professes to be neutral, not against China, but just taking officially taking no sides and doing nothing to undermine the Chinese position. Just like Beijing, while not recognizing Crimea, is not as part of Russia, is not doing anything to undermine the status quo on the peninsula. Many outside observers, primarily in the West, have been speculating for a long time that this partnership, or entente as I call it, is just too good to be true. China and Russia are known to have very different interests, and despite the commonality of some of their positions on the world scene, they don't always have similar positions on important issues. So when push comes to shove, they're bound to run into each other, to collide. A favorite area of potential Sino-Russian collision has historically been named Central Asia. But it's interesting what's happening in Central Asia. China is getting more and more dominant economically in that region, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. And Russia does not really publicly object to that, or does not push back economically or in other ways politically against that. On the other hand, the region is still very much dependent on at least let me qualify my statement. Some countries in the region continue to be very dependent on Russian security assistance. And Russia, as a security player, is very much present in the region. China, which also has security interests in Central Asia, has been very careful not to step on Russia's toes in Central Asia. China has been increasing its presence, non-economic presence, including to a degree military presence, but in ways that would not call for a Russian pushback. We'll see how it develops, but at this point, it is a very clear division of labor between the economic power China and the security power Russia. It's also interesting how China and Russia collaborated in the ongoing crisis over North Korea. In the past, the leadership in Pyongyang, particularly the grandfather of the current young leader, Kim Il-sung, used to play Beijing off Moscow and benefited from that, particularly when China and the Soviet Union began to compete very hard, including for North Korea. But this time, Russia understands the relative importance of North Korea to China, which is higher than the importance of North Korea to Russia. And basically, the Russians have allowed the Chinese to be the leaders in managing the North Korean situation, playing the second fiddle to North Korea. Some people say that this is an example of Russia accepting China's leadership and Russia accepting the role of China's junior partner. I would disagree with that. I think this is a very wise position to take in a country that, again, in relative terms, means so much more to China than it does to Russia. On the other hand, Russia continues to have very strong security relationships with the countries that see China as a potential adversary. I'm talking about India, but also Vietnam. So much for the geopolitics of the relationship. In economic terms, China, of course, has become more important to Russia following the break with the West and the restrictions imposed on technology transfers, on economic relationships. Some people who knew very little about China, some Russians, I mean, hoped after 2014 that China would replace the European Union to the Russians, a very strange suggestion. Of course, those people were very soon disappointed. But nevertheless, China has strengthened its role as Russia's principal economic partner in terms of, if you count country by country, the trade volume is nearing $100 billion between the two. So it's recovered. It's about to recover what it lost after 2014 when the oil price plunged, and that undercut Russia's exports, but also Russia's imports. Not only is China the number one trading partner of the Russian Federation. Again, let me say, so that you are not misled, that collectively the European Union is several times more trade with Russia than China. But in terms of countries, China is number one. But China has also become number one in the field that was not usually, but always led by a Western European country, i.e. Germany. The import by Russia of machine tools. That, I think, is a very important mark of the changing times. So what is Russia going to do with regard to relations with China? I think that the Russian policy could be analyzed as follows. Moscow tries to strengthen the political relationship, particularly the personal relationship between President Putin and President Xi Jinping. This relationship plays a pivotal role, I'm talking about the personal relationship, pivotal role in the overall bilateral relationship. Russia is also trying with moderate success to improve the balance of its economic relations with China, so that the dependency that exists is not so one-sided as it has been so far. And indeed, Russia does have some advantages, which may not be as numerous as the advantages that China holds over Russia, but are still pretty important. Russia is a major source of raw materials for China, which is poor in terms of raw materials to be mined at home. Russia is the chief source of military technology to China, military, also space, also nuclear energy. Russia takes the lead on those areas. And Russia is still the largest depository in the world of such precious things as, say, fresh water, Lake Baikal, and the rivers of Siberia. So Russia tries to play its strengths, which again also include a few other items such as grain and more broadly agricultural produce. So Russia tries to play with those advantages to make the relationship less unequal. But politically, the idea is, I believe, to embed China in a web of friendly relationships on a multilateral basis. Within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or within BRICS, or within other multilateral bodies, where China may be the biggest member, but not dominant, and will not be dominant because of the factor of being embedded in those organizations, being, if you like, integrated into them, and not being able or willing to wield dominance against its partners in those organizations. I think Russia's politicians are subtly sending the message to the politicians in Beijing that you are so much better off as a very highly regarded member of the group. If you, for whatever reason, decide to go on your own and promote your interests against the interests of others, then those others are likely to resist you collectively, and you will be worse off. So the idea is that China can achieve a lot if it plays ball with its neighbors and others, including with Russia. I have about 5 more minutes to go, so I will briefly discuss India, Japan, Korea, and the Middle East, about a minute each. I spent so much time discussing China because I really believe that this is the most important relationship. And a lot will depend on how Russia handles that relationship, whether it has a strategy, a foreign policy strategy, a domestic economic and demographic strategy, infrastructure strategy that would keep the relationship with its biggest neighbor on an even keel. Now, India. Relations between Moscow and Delhi have always been essentially non-problematic. I feel like this is the one and only major power with which historically Russia has had a friendly relationship. So this traditional friendship that has almost become a figure of speech in both countries, unfortunately has frayed a little bit after the end of the Soviet Union. India opened up to the rest of the world. India became a successful participant in the globalization drive. Russia lost a lot of its economic power, technological advantage, and was mired for a long time in its own problems. Now things may be looking up, but just a little bit. Russia is, I think, becoming increasingly aware of the need to return to a closer relationship with India. President Putin, who last year could only spend a certain number of hours on a visit to India, is planning a much longer visit this year. He's already met with Prime Minister Modi in Russia. Russia is also stimulated in its drive to refurbish its relations with Delhi by increasing competition from the United States, primarily in the area that heretofore had been essentially a Russian preserve, and that is the export of military items, of arms and weapon systems. India clearly is most interested in having the technology to produce weaponry and other high-tech products on its own. And Russia has something to share in that field, but that would require, in my view, a much more proactive and much more strategic policy vis-a-vis Delhi. I think that in order to manage China in Greater Eurasia, Russia should put a lot of emphasis on its relations with Delhi. Japan. This relationship, although it is between Russia and a U.S. alliance partner, is essentially not focused on security things, not focused on arms and on geostrategy. It is very squarely focused from the Russian perspective on issues of finance, and economics, and technology. There's a problem, clearly, as Russia seeks to reach out to its technologically very capable and very rich neighbor. The problem is that this is an ally of the United States, and the sanctions agreed upon within the Western community fully apply to relations between Russia and Japan. With Prime Minister Abe very keen on improving relations with Russia and solving finally the territorial issue between the two countries. Moscow's policy, it seems to me, is focused on getting as much economic goodies from Japan as possible before considering to hand over any piece of disputed territory. We'll see. The end game will be played in the next couple of years, as long as Prime Minister Abe is in power. I think when he goes, the chances, and if there's no final solution at that time, it will take an indefinitely long period of time for the next opportunity to arise.